Hello everyone and welcome back to another felting tutorial. We are needle felting the very popular and cute Valais Blacknose Sheep. I've been wanting to create this animal for a really long time and now I've finally got the materials I needed to get started. So without further ado, let's get into the tools. So I have a few different tools here that are going into this project, some of which aren't normally used in needle felting. One of them being marshmallow roasting sticks, and I'll get into the purpose of these in a bit. I've also got my felting needle and a pair of carded brushes that I actually didn't end up using. And of course I've got my felting mat. And for a fun twist, instead of using carded wool, today I'm going to be using yarn instead. I myself don't actually have any use for yarn. I don't crochet or anything. I actually bought this bundle of yarn scraps from a charity shop. It was a bit of an impulse buy because when I saw these, I noticed that they were all really nice natural colors and all had different fun textures to them, and I just had a light bulb go off in my head that they would be so perfect for this type of project. And because I usually don't buy wool locks because they're usually quite expensive, and also I thought this was a good way to just repurpose and reuse someone else's unwanted scraps. These scraps may have been donated for a number of reasons, but either way, I have a ton of ideas for what I want to make. I was thinking llamas or alpacas, any fluffy animal I wouldn't otherwise be able to make without locks. For this project, however, I'm going to be using the black and the white yarn. So to create my own DIY wool locks, this is where the roasting sticks will come in handy. I've unwinded the yarn and rewinded it tightly around these two wooden sticks. I tried to make as much use of the space on the sticks as I could, to hopefully get as many curls in as possible. I mainly needed the black yarn to turn to curls because luckily for me, I checked out the white yarn, and it actually seemed to keep its curls on its own, which is good, much less prep work for me. But I still did a bit of white yarn just to see if it would turn out curlier. And after I finished winding these colors around, I dampened the yarn and left them to dry on the sticks for the day. And the next day, after drying these for quite a while, I pulled the yarn off the sticks, and unsurprisingly, the white yarn did not look any different curl-wise. But on the other hand, the first pull of the black yarn was very satisfying, to see that what was left was some lovely and nicely curled yarn. Onto a semi-important part of creating any needle felted sculpture is creating the armature. I say semi-important because it isn't a need. Wool can be sculpted without an armature, but I however do think it makes starting a project much easier. Speaking of prepping, I don't measure out the amount of wire I'm using. I just make a rough guess using my hands. I know that's not a great way to go, but that's just how I do it. So with that in mind, I like to shape the skeleton first without twisting the wire. I've folded the wire in half and think of it as each half representing the left and the right side of the body. The first fold being the nose of the armature, down to the second being the front feet, and then I folded it back up to where the neck and the chest meet. The next fold leading from the armature's back to where the tail is going to be, again down to the hind legs, and then back up to the tail, where both ends of the wire end. And now that I've got the perfect amount of wire, I can cut it off and can now set up the armature correctly, and follow the same process but pinching and twisting the wire together as I move along. So keep in mind, since this wire I'm using is quite thin, I need to twist it together to make it sturdy. I use jewelry wire that is about 1mm thick, but there is thicker wire that people use, which takes up less prep time to creating a sturdy armature. But it really is quite easy in general to create the skeleton. I'm hoping this video demonstration will be better than I can describe. So to restart the armature, I'll fold it in half once again, but now I'll pinch the wire at the end of each bend, where a new limb will start. Making sure it's twisted well and making sure there isn't any holes in the twists. If there's holes, the felting needle could get stuck and break while I'm felting, and we don't want that. And I'll just continue this process throughout the skeleton. It can get a bit confusing, so I try to keep the two sides of the wire separated while I twist each limb one piece at a time. And you'll notice that I make sure to define all the joints and the bends on the sculpture so that they are distinguishable enough for when I get to felting around them. And then to end it off, I twist the two ends together for a tail. And now that I've got the perfect armature, I can start sculpting the body with wool. You can see that I've left the armature's tail quite long, and that's because the sculpture can become quite thick around the armature. And if I were to leave it short, it would make it difficult to felt around. Remember that when it's fully sculpted and covered with layers of wool, the sculpture itself will become much larger than the armature. I'm using core wool to create the base of the body. I'll begin with a small amount of wool at first, and then I'll wrap it around the armature, and then I'll just felt it, leaving it slightly airy. I usually start with the back half of the armature and work the wool towards the front half. Either way, I just want the armature to be sturdy. I like to make sure I wrap the core wool well around every limb on the armature and not have any of the wires showing. And during this process, it can make the wool very thick in those areas. Which is good, because if I accidentally poke a wire with my felting needle while needle felting, it'll for sure break. And I'll just keep adding wool and make sure I wrap it around other limbs too, as to secure it and make it sturdier. This can be quite a long and tedious task to get started and to finish. I want to say this is the most time-consuming part of creating a needle felted piece, but I promise it doesn't take an eternity. And just so you don't lose your mind out of boredom, I've sped up the process just for you. once I finish sculpting the main base of the body, I'll move to the legs, and you'll notice that as I felt wool around the legs, I'll do my best to continue to portray the joints and all the bends around the front and back legs. Now, adding wool around the wire just to cover the armature isn't enough most of the time because it can just end up looking very flat and square shaped. So to make it look more realistic for the finished product, it's best to add more wool around the shoulders, hind legs, and all around sides of the belly. And this will just make it more chunky looking, giving more depth to the sculpture. So you'll see me adding more wool, but not too much. I don't want the wool to be too dense. I rather want the wool to be more quite squishy feeling so that it's still easy to felt into for the next step. So once I'm done sculpting the wool on the upper half of the body, I'm going to switch from using white core wool to using black core wool instead, and continue to sculpt the legs. I don't do this for all of my projects, only the ones that need a dark base underneath before I start layering, so that when I do start layering, the yarn on top of it will just blend in nicely. I learned this trick a few projects ago when I first noticed that sometimes when I'm layering wool onto the sculpture and using a white core wool underneath, it can a lot of the times peek through and ruin the blended layers I've already felted on top, especially if I'm using a reverse needle, so that's a little tip if you've been running into that problem. So this is just me felting the black wool around the legs. I also just want to mention that it can be really difficult felting around small legs like these, and around an armature in general, just because the wire does get in the way a lot. But I just take it slow and felt the wool in at an angle. I really like to make sure to securely felt the armature's legs for a few reasons. One being, I for sure don't want the wire to poke through the wool easily. So I make sure it's really padded with wool around all sides, especially on the bottom. Another thing I'd like to mention is because I don't fully plan out when I'm making an armature, sometimes when I'm making the skeleton, the legs don't always end up being the same length at the end. And if I want the finished piece to stand up straight without needing a support, I felt wool at the bottom and check all the feet are level with each other. So just keep that in mind as you watch me sculpt the 4 legs with the black wool. Once those are finished, I want to attach the 4 black posts to the main base of the body. And I want to keep it blended, so I'm going to wrap it around with white wool on top, and it makes a nice gradient from black to white. Now here we have the completed core body. This makes for the perfect underbase for a felted project. If the bottom layer were to ever show at all, I wouldn't need to try to hide it by felting more layers on top, or even if I ended up using a reverse needle, I wouldn't have any worries about the core wall ruining a blended effect. And now on to the most time-consuming process of them all, which is layering the wool, or in this case, the yarn. As you can see, I have next to me my previously prepped and nicely curled DIY locks that I made a few steps back. I'll take a long string and cut it into quite small strips, about an inch long, and pre-cutting a lot of these little strips so I don't have to pause between felting to take the time to cut more yarn. So starting at the bottom of the feet with the black strips of yarn, and I'll felt these small pieces around the hooves. If you've seen any of my other videos, you may know that I personally like to start layering on the hind legs first, only because I find it easier considering how the wool falls. And of course, I am always looking at my reference pictures when felting real animals, just so that I can portray them to the best of my ability. And I noticed that Valais sheep have black fur bordered around their hooves, and then it turns to white, which will now explain why I've made the core base the way I did. The black yarn is barely visible to my camera, but I'll tell you that it is very curly. Even though some of the curls have unraveled a bit, they kind of look like little pom-poms. It's super cute. So as you can guess, after I finish felting the black around the hooves, as I move up the legs, I'll start using the white yarn instead, and start with the real work of felting the rest of the body. To use the white yarn, I've unraveled it and pulled it apart into 3 strands. And they are super curly to begin with. Like I said at the beginning, these little wavy curls did seem to keep and hold their shape. And I think they will do even after being felted into the sculpture. To layer the wool on the body, I'm folding the strips in half and felting them through the center. And I'll continue felting layers in this process all around the legs and the body. Felting these layers in horizontally up the legs, but I do occasionally felt in layers vertically if it's needed, like in a small hard to reach spot. Anyway, back to layering the yarn. I was cutting the strips a bit too short at first, which I do to save wool, but that quickly became too difficult to felt into the base. So I started to cut them a bit longer so I could felt the yarn into the sculpture deeper. And I'll continue this layering process throughout the whole body, trimming and clipping off the excess yarn if it's too long. And now that I'm moving up the base onto the larger areas, here's a pro tip. If you're making a project like this that's small and it contains a wire armature inside, and you're needing to layer the wool inside and outside of the project, definitely start from the inner side first. I like to layer from the inside of the legs first completely, and then felt layers on the outside. When working with small projects like this, my felting needle will often poke through the project and onto the other side quite often. And if that happens, it can very often create sort of like matting on the opposite side. And it'll just end up kind of bunched up and not having that nice flowy layer. So it's more ideal to have the matted side be on the inner side, because it's not as visible. Once I've felted layers on the inner side, I'll move to the outer side of the body and continue layering just like I was before. Also, while looking at the references, these sheep have the cutest characteristics that I've ever seen on a sheep. Not only do they have those really cute faces, which you can't even get a good idea of because it's like looking into the abyss, but they have these really cute black patches on their elbows, knees, elbows. Anyway, it's super cute, I think, and I think you'll be happy to know that I did take this into account while creating this little guy. And look at how fluffy it becomes. Keep in mind that this is just one leg. Imagine how fluffy the entire sculpture will be when fully layered. I don't think I have much commentary from this point on, but I'll try to hop in and give my 1 or 2 takes on the following steps. So please enjoy the rest of this video. After felting in layers on the hind legs, it's time to move on to layering on the underbelly and the back. And you'll see that once I get to reaching the neck of the sheep, I'll pause the layers there and I'll instead move down to felt layers around the front legs first. And I of course like to keep those joints and bends defined. So with my scissors, I'll use them to sculpt the layers of yarn a bit by rounding out the corners and the bends of the joint to soften the look. And the same will go for around the body of the sheep, so making the layers a bit rounded, especially on the underbelly. And again, this helps the sculpture look less flat and square and more chunky, which is more realistic in portraying this animal's body structure. Now that I am nearly finishing with this project, I do get very excited to move on from felting layers and onto something new, which is the second to last step, where I'll be giving my creation a cute little face. So to start, I've got my core wool back at my side. I've pulled a sliver of wool and felted one end into the body so that I can easily wrap it around the visible wire armature. And I'm just using a small amount of core wool to start, and if I end up needing extra, I can always add more. I don't want to accidentally add too much wool when sculpting the head because it could end up quite silly if the sheep ended up having a little body and a big head. So to avoid this, I like to take into account that when I add core wool and when the layers of yarn are added on top of it, it contributes to how large the head will be. So with that in mind, I'll felt the core wool tightly around the wire and make sure to attach the head and neck together as well as to the main base of the body, connecting these all together seamlessly with the core wool. Once I have the base of the head ready, I then like to take notice of the sheep's face and head characteristics, to be able to plan ahead and estimate what goes where and how it should look. But before I add details, I like to add in the little beaded eyes first to go underneath everything. And to add these on, I'll take a little strip of core wool and felt it into a tough thin string that won't pull apart easily. The beads I use for eyes have small holes that run through the center. There are other types of beads you can use for eyes, but most of them involve using glue. As much as I'm used to felting around wire, I found it makes it more difficult than ever to felt around areas if glue is used. Once I've got a strong strip of core wool, I'll use my felt needle to push the string through the bead, leaving it in the center of the string. I'll then pull the string apart, leaving the bead trapped in the middle. Pulling the ends apart also makes for an easier attachment to the head. Once I find the right spot for the eyes, I usually mark it and then make a hole with my scissors. And once I've made two decently sized holes for the beads to fit into, I like to make sure that the two ends of the strings are frayed enough to easily felt into place. And I'll push the bead in and secure it by felting both ends of the string inside the socket. Once both the eyes are securely attached, I'll look at them from all angles to make sure that they're perfectly aligned. I also have to add that it looks a little bit silly having to squish the sheep's face like this. I just think that at this point of the creation, it always looks a little bit funny to see it looking like it has a bald head. And once I'm happy with that, I can move on to adding extra details, which in this case isn't much since these sheep seem almost faceless, but I've taken a patch of black wool and felted it flat on my felting mat. With no real shape in mind, most of the nose area will be covered in black wool, if not covered with curly white yarn. So to add details to the face, I've added on a black patch of wool for the nose of the sheep. This is all the detail that I'm adding for now. I was thinking about adding black curly yarn to the nose area to add a bit more extra depth, but looking at my reference pictures, I decided not to. And now I can continue layering layers of yarn around the neck and then eventually onto the head. As you can see, this is the pile of yarn that has accumulated throughout this video from all of the yarn that has been cut off from this creation. And you may have noticed this is also the scraps in the opening of this video, as well as the thumbnail. I actually came with that idea of making it look like the sheep was getting sheared at this point of creating the project, while looking at these scraps in my hand, like oh my god, that's perfect. Because believe it or not, it's actually really hard to think of a cool thumbnail, especially since I'm not used to it besides making TikToks. But YouTube thumbnails obviously have to be way more enticing. But yeah, I laid some of these scraps onto the finished project, and I also felted a teeny tiny little shaver if you noticed it, so that was really fun to make. If you really like that opening, I encourage you to wait till the end of this video for a little stop motion that I've also done. Once the felted layers come to reaching the top of the head, I like to felt in the ears first, so that the layers that come after will cover any previous colors. To make the ears, I've taken a small amount of black wool and felted it down onto my felting mat, and into a diamond shape. I've decided it would be a good idea to also add some more texture to the ears, so I've layered some curls on top just to add more detail. And I think adding curls to the ears really made a difference in what the ears could have looked like had I not done so. So after the curls were added, I flipped the ears over onto what would be the inner side, and I folded it kind of onto itself, while felting around the edges of the ear to make it a bit concaved. And to make sure the ears aren't too scruffy, I've trimmed off some of the frayed edges just to clean it up a bit. Before I attach these little floppy ears to the head, I pay close attention to the reference pictures. So I've carefully placed the felted ears just behind and above the eyes. And I have to be really careful about felting these in because the armature wire is quite close to the surface within this small amount of wool. But once those are secured, I felt more of the curly yarn on top and just cover up the black yarn. Once I start layering past the ears, I've layered white yarn around the eyes, leaving a small border in between, which is where I'm going to felt in some black wool. And I've also left the layers at the top of the head quite long so that it'll droop down and cover the eyes anyways. We are so close to being almost done with this little guy, we just need to add a little scruffy tail. So if you don't remember why I left the wire for the tail quite long, is so that this part can be easy peasy to create and to attach to the main base. But first off, I don't need both of these two twisted wires together. It would be so difficult to fit around two wires in such a small area, so I'll cut one off and hide it well enough so that it won't poke out. And I'll rebend the end so it's not pointy. So to create the tail, I'll start it the same way I do all the other limbs. I'll tightly wrap around the wire with core wool and felt it into itself and into the main base of the body, through the bottom to fully connect these two parts together. And of course, we can't not make this tail fluffy, so back to layering little layers of yarn, starting from the inner side of the tail, from the larger end to the smaller end, and then doing the same on the top side, and I'll just trim it as well, even though it is super cute being so scruffy. And here we have the super cute and cuddly finished piece of the lovely Valais Blacknose Sheep, and I must say I am super happy with how this turned out. I feel like I've learned quite a lot from this project. This was my first time creating a sheep and creating a curly haired animal in general. Using this new method of using curly yarn instead of wool, I found it really fun. I think the texture turned out so perfect. It's exactly what I had hoped for when I first bought these yarns, so I'm glad it worked out and my need to buy the yarn is going to a good use. Since I used a wire skeleton in this project, the sheep is fully posable from its head to its tail. It's got a good range of motion. I can move its head to look either side, and the legs are also quite bendable for the most part. Where the wool is really thick, however, it can be difficult to bend sometimes, but it really is easy to pose it in any way. I always like to play with the posability of my creations and put them in cute little poses for thumbnails and also to create stop motion videos. Speaking of which, I've promised to stop motion at the end of this video, so if you've made it to this point, please comment stop motion down below so I know that you've made it through the whole video. And thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to comment and share your thoughts. Are you going to make a Valais Blacknose Sheep as well? Please subscribe for more needle felting tutorials just like this one. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!